Chapter 1. The Autumn Fair in Marleycombe. Marleycombe was the kind of village that artists loved to paint and travelers longed to discover. Nestled in a fold of gentle green hills, with crooked lanes and tidy hedgerows, it seemed, at least to the casual visitor, the very picture of English tranquility. Yet, as Miss Marple often observed, villages had a way of hiding all manner of unquiet truths beneath their pretty exteriors. The autumn fair had come to Marleycombe, and the high street was a cheerful tangle of stalls and banners, the smell of roasted chestnuts and sugared almonds wafting in the air. Children darted between booths, clutching toffee apples. The village brass band played a slightly wobbly tune from the green, while a group of ladies from the Women's Institute arranged jars of jam in neat rows for judging. Miss Marple, dressed in her familiar grey coat with a small hat perched at a precise angle, was not one for fairs as a rule. She had come, however, at the urging of her friend Mrs. Weatherby, who had insisted that one cannot live entirely among roses and knitting. Jane, a little bustle is good for the soul. And so Miss Marple, with her polite smile and keen eyes, found herself among the throng, watching everything with quiet interest. It was the sort of day when nothing untoward ought to happen. Yet, the village fair was rarely without its little dramas. Near the coconut shy, young Peter Chandler, son of the local doctor, was overheard quarreling heatedly with Harold Pritchard, a farmer's boy with a reputation for trouble. Mrs. Pierce, the butcher's wife, nearly fainted when her prize sponge failed to rise properly in the oven that morning, declaring it a deliberate sabotage. Meanwhile, old Mr. Sims, who had perhaps indulged a little too freely in cider, was causing a stir by loudly insisting he had seen a stranger loitering near the churchyard last night, whistling something queer. "That's as may be," said Mrs. Weatherby, folding her arms with emphasis, "but I dare say old Sims imagines half of what he says. Still, a whistle in the graveyard at night is enough to give one shivers." Miss Marple's ears pricked up. She said nothing, merely adjusting her gloves and letting the conversation pass. By late afternoon, as clouds gathered and the last of the prizes were handed out, the fair came to a cheerful close. Children were bundled home, the brass band packed away their instruments, and the green grew quieter once more. Miss Marple lingered a while, enjoying the cool air, before making her way back toward the vicarage, where she was staying as a guest. It was only later, when the bells struck 9 and the village lay in calm darkness, that the peace was broken. A scream rang out from near the churchyard. A woman's voice, sharp with terror. Doors opened, lamps flickered to life, and soon half the village was rushing toward the source of the noise. By the time Miss Marple, with her steady step, reached the gate of St. Bartholomew's, a crowd had gathered. There, among the leaning gravestones and dark yews, lay the body of Harold Pritchard, sprawled awkwardly on the ground. His face was pale, his eyes wide open to the night sky, and from somewhere, faint but unmistakable, a whistle still echoed, soft, chilling, and gone before anyone could name the tune. Miss Marple, standing at the edge of the crowd, tightened her lips. She said nothing, but her eyes, sharp as pins, missed nothing. The autumn fair of Marleycombe would not be remembered for sponge cakes or jam jars. It would be remembered for murder. Chapter 2. Morning Gossip in Marleycombe. By morning, the whole of Marleycombe was buzzing with the news. The murder of Harold Pritchard had flown from house to house faster than the church bells could ring, carried on whispers through open windows and down garden fences. At the post office, Mrs. Ellis could hardly keep her hands steady as she sorted letters. She declared to anyone who would listen that it was a dreadful business, dreadful indeed, and that she had always thought Harold wild and unruly, the sort to come to a bad end. At the grocer's, Mr. Flint had his own theory. "If you ask me," he said loudly, weighing sugar for Mrs. Pierce, "it was a quarrel over money. These young lads borrow more than they can pay back. Gambling, likely. Cards in the back room of the pub, if truth be told." Mrs. Pierce, fanning herself dramatically, offered her own tidbit. She had heard from her cousin's daughter that Harold was keeping company with a girl from the next village, Rosehill, though whether in courtship or in scandalous secrecy, no one could quite say. By the time the morning service at St. Bartholomew's was concluded, the vicar himself had to raise his voice above the hum of speculation. His sermon on charity and patience fell on ears that were far more eager for whispers of motives and murder. Miss Marple, sitting quietly in a pew near the back, neither added to the gossip nor discouraged it. She listened, her thin hands folded neatly in her lap, her pale eyes thoughtful. She knew very well that gossip, however careless, often contained the seeds of truth, though hidden among exaggerations, mistakes, and outright inventions. After the service, the villagers lingered in clusters by the lich gate, their breath rising in the crisp air. Inspector Graves, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a brisk manner, arrived to make his inquiries. He was well known to Miss Marple, having once consulted her, albeit reluctantly, on a case some years back. Now, he said firmly, raising his hand to quiet the crowd. There's no need for panic. Yes, it is murder. Yes, we are investigating. But you will all do best to keep to your homes and let the police do their work. That, of course, only set tongues wagging more. Mrs. Weatherby clutched Miss Marple's arm as they walked back toward the vicarage. It's a ghastly thing, Jane. Poor Harold, lying there cold among the graves. Do you suppose it could have been someone from outside the village? A tramp, perhaps, or a thief? Miss Marple gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. My dear, in my experience, murder rarely comes from strangers. One needn't look far afield. Human nature is much the same in Marleycombe as it is anywhere else. Mrs. Weatherby shivered. Then you think it was one of us? Miss Marple did not answer directly. She paused to admire a climbing rose on a cottage wall, though her mind was far from flowers. She was thinking of Harold Pritchard's face, angry at the fair, lifeless in the graveyard. She was thinking, too, of that eerie whistle, floating in the dark. People often reveal more than they intend when they are frightened, she said at last, in her quiet way. We must listen carefully and watch. And Miss Marple, who had lived long enough to know that every smile could conceal a secret, prepared to do just that. Chapter 3. Strange Behaviors and Early Clues. The police wasted no time in combing through the graveyard. Inspector Graves had ordered constables to search every corner for signs of struggle, for footprints, for anything that might explain how Harold Pritchard had met his end. The villagers, naturally, found excuses to pass by, peering over the stone wall or pretending to tend to graves of distant relatives. Few in Marleycombe could resist the pull of tragedy, especially when it unfolded in their own backyards. Miss Marple, under the pretext of taking a gentle morning stroll, paused at the lich gate. Her gaze drifted over the mossy stones, the worn grass, and the yew trees that cast such deep shadows. She did not cross the police tape, of course. She was far too polite for that, but her eyes, sharp and steady, followed every movement. She noticed, for instance, that Harold's cap, a tweed flat cap he was rarely seen without, was missing. Odd, she thought. A village lad might be careless with money or tempers, but never with his cap. She also observed that Harold's boots, though muddy, had a curious scuff across the left sole, as if he had slipped or been dragged. It was a detail no one else seemed to remark upon. "Best you move along, Miss Marple," Inspector Graves called, not unkindly. "We'll have the report once it's ready." "Of course, Inspector," she said with her mild smile. "I only wondered. Was Harold carrying anything? A book, perhaps, or a letter?" The inspector frowned, surprised by the question. "No, nothing of the sort." "Why?" "Oh, nothing," Miss Marple replied vaguely. But her thoughts were already turning. She had heard Mrs. Pierce at the grocer's mention Harold's supposed sweetheart in Rosehill. Letters, in such cases, were often part of the story. Later that day, she took tea with Mrs. Weatherby and the vicar's wife, Mrs. Calthorpe, both of whom were bursting with speculation. "I cannot fathom it," Mrs. Calthorpe declared, pouring tea with a trembling hand. "Why kill Harold? He was rough about the edges, yes, but hardly worth murdering." "Unless," Mrs. Weatherby said darkly, "he knew something he ought not." Miss Marple stirred her tea with quiet precision. "Or unless he was inconvenient to someone. People are often removed when they stand in the way, of money, of affection, of reputation." Her companion shuddered, but Miss Marple was not one to flinch from plain truths. As the evening fell, she made one final note to herself. She had seen young Peter Chandler, the doctor's son, walking quickly down a side lane near dusk, his face pale and his hands stuffed deep into his pockets. When she called a polite greeting, he startled like a guilty boy, muttered something indistinct, and hurried on. Miss Marple watched him go, her expression unreadable. There were, she knew, secrets enough in Marleycombe to fill a graveyard. The task now was to find which secret had led to murder. Chapter 4. The Wrong Suspect. 2 days after the discovery in the graveyard, Inspector Graves announced he had made an arrest. The news swept through Marleycombe like wildfire, setting tongues wagging and hearts thumping with a curious mixture of relief and disbelief. The suspect was none other than Peter Chandler, the doctor's son. "It makes perfect sense," declared Mr. Flint at the grocer's, with the authority of a man who always believed his own conclusions. "Everyone knows Peter and Harold had words at the fair. Saw it with my own eyes. And wasn't Harold sniffing round Peter's sister Margaret? There's your motive, plain as daylight." Mrs. Pierce agreed, though with a sniff. "And I heard from Mrs. Gibbons that young Peter has debts, little gambling slips, mind you. If Harold threatened to tell the doctor, well, that would be enough, wouldn't it?" By the time the village convened in the pub that evening, poor Peter was already half condemned. Miss Marple, however, was not so quick to judge. She sat in the corner of the snug with her knitting, listening as the men argued over tankards of ale. Her needles clicked steadily, her face serene, but her mind ticked faster than any clock. Inspector Graves himself stopped by, receiving the praise and congratulations of the villagers. Yet Miss Marple, with her mild smile, quietly intercepted him before he left. "You are very confident in young Chandler's guilt, Inspector?" she asked. Graves frowned slightly. "We've motive, opportunity, and a witness who heard them quarreling. What more could one want?" "Ah," Miss Marple said softly, "but sometimes quarrels are a symptom, not a cause. And sometimes the person who looks most guilty is the one most convenient to blame." The inspector gave her a tolerant smile. "With respect, Miss Marple, I must follow the evidence, not village gossip." "Quite right," she agreed politely. Yet, as she watched him go, she thought of Peter's startled face when she had seen him hurrying down the lane. Fear, yes, but was it the fear of a murderer? Or of a young man hiding some other secret? The next morning, Miss Marple walked past the Chandler house. Margaret Chandler, a quiet, serious girl with gentle eyes, was in the garden. When she saw Miss Marple, she quickly brushed at her face, as though to wipe away tears. "My poor brother," she whispered. "They think he's capable of such a thing. But he isn't. I know he isn't." Miss Marple laid a comforting hand on the girl's arm. "My dear, the truth has a way of revealing itself. We must simply be patient and observant." Her eyes strayed toward the churchyard, where the yews swayed gently in the wind. Somewhere in Marleycombe, the real killer walked free, and Miss Marple intended to find them. Chapter 5. Secrets begin to surface. The arrest of Peter Chandler might have satisfied Inspector Graves, but in Marleycombe it only stirred the pot deeper. For while some villagers nodded and said justice had been done, others could not resist leaning closer, lowering their voices, and whispering what they really knew, or thought they knew. Miss Marple, seated at her window with her knitting, let the fragments drift to her from all directions, like pieces of a puzzle tumbling into her lap. 1. The farmer's grudge. It was Mrs. Pierce who first mentioned that Harold had been quarreling not just with Peter Chandler but also with Mr. Godfrey Blake, the farmer whose land bordered the Pritchard fields. Blake was a hard man, known for his temper and sharp dealings. Rumor had it Harold had caught him selling off livestock that didn't rightly belong to him. "Mark my words," Mrs. Pierce said darkly to Miss Marple. "Men have been killed for less than that." 2. The vicar's wife and a whisper. Meanwhile, Mrs. Calthorpe, the vicar's wife, confided something she had not dared say aloud before. She had once seen Harold slip into the church vestry after dusk, when no service was scheduled. He emerged some 20 minutes later, looking flushed and tucking something into his jacket pocket. "I said nothing at the time," Mrs. Calthorpe admitted, twisting her hands. "But I cannot help but wonder now, what was he doing there?" 3. The girl from Rosehill. Then there was the matter of the girl. Gossip had spread like ivy through the lanes that Harold had been courting a young woman in the neighboring village of Rosehill. Some said her name was Clara Jennings. Others insisted it was her cousin. Either way, Harold had been seen at the Rosehill Inn more often than was respectable. Mrs. Weatherby leaned close to Miss Marple at tea. "And if the poor girl was in trouble, Jane, you know how tongues wag. A scandal might have ruined more than Harold's reputation. It could touch families on both sides." 4. The doctor's shadow. And then, quite suddenly, another name began to surface. Not Peter Chandler, but his father, Dr. Chandler. He had been Harold's doctor for a minor injury some weeks before, a cut hand from farm tools. And it was said, though never confirmed, that Harold had threatened to speak of something he had overheard at the surgery. No one could say what that was. But Harold, it seemed, had a way of hearing things he ought not. Miss Marple absorbed all of this with the quiet patience of a gardener watching shoots rise from the soil. Each scrap was like a seed. Some would grow into nothing, mere weeds. But one, perhaps two, would flower into truth. That evening, as she sat by the fire, she recalled Harold's face at the fair, flushed with anger as he argued with Peter Chandler. But what if that quarrel was merely the visible tip of a much larger tangle beneath? Human nature, Miss Marple murmured softly to herself, setting down her knitting. It is always the same. Rivalries, jealousies, fears of exposure. All the world over, the causes differ, but the pattern remains. Outside, the wind rattled the churchyard gate. For a moment, faint and uncanny, it almost sounded like a whistle drifting through the night. Chapter 6. The Second Shock. For a brief span, it seemed as though Marleycombe might begin to settle again. Inspector Graves was satisfied with Peter Chandler in custody, and though murmurs of doubt persisted, many villagers preferred the comfort of believing the matter resolved. But life in Marleycombe rarely obliged so neatly. It was on a damp Thursday evening, for days after Harold's body had been found, that the village was shaken once more. Mrs. Calthorpe, returning late from a Women's Institute meeting, passed by the graveyard. The air was thick with mist, curling low between the yews. She walked faster, clutching her shawl close about her shoulders, when suddenly she froze. From the darkness came a sound, a whistle. Low, drawn out, eerie in the still air. Mrs. Calthorpe's heart thumped so hard she thought she might faint. She stumbled, nearly dropping her lantern, and hurried the rest of the way home without daring to look back. By morning, the story had spread. The whistle had been heard again. And worse, the sexton, old Mr. Holloway, had discovered that the vestry door of St. Bartholomew's had been forced sometime in the night. Inside, papers were scattered, and a small locked cabinet had been pried open. Its contents, parish records and a few private letters, were in disarray. Inspector Graves was furious. "Some fool trying to stir up superstition," he barked. "Breaking into the vestry for old documents. Nonsense. Nothing of value there." But Miss Marple, standing quietly among the onlookers, noted how carefully the cabinet had been forced, and how particular the disturbance was. Not the wild mess of a vandal, but the precise search of someone looking for something specific. She bent closer to one of the papers, half hidden beneath a pew. It was a christening record from 20 years earlier. At first unremarkable. Yet her sharp eyes noticed the ink of one name, slightly smudged as though altered. She said nothing, but folded the observation neatly into her mind. That afternoon, she called on Mrs. Weatherby. "I wonder, my dear, do you recall if Harold Pritchard's family had always lived here in Marleycombe? Or did they come from elsewhere?" Mrs. Weatherby frowned. "Oh, they've been here a good while, but now that you mention it, I do recall whispers about his mother. Some said she wasn't married when Harold was born. But that was hushed up, of course." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. "People will go to great lengths to conceal such matters," she said, "especially if concealment gives them power." That night, once again, the wind sighed through the village lanes, and more than one resident swore they heard it carry a ghostly whistle from the churchyard. The murder of Harold Pritchard, it seemed, was not to be the village's only disturbance. Something darker was still unfurling. Chapter 7. Whispers of the Past. Marleycombe was not a place where secrets stayed buried for long. Yet the curious thing about villages, Miss Marple reflected, was that once something was known, it often became distorted by retelling. A whispered truth might turn into scandal, and scandal with time into accepted fact, whether true or not. Over the following days, more fragments emerged, each one deepening the shadows around Harold Pritchard's death. The Pritchard household. Miss Marple paid a polite visit to Mrs. Pritchard, Harold's widowed mother. The woman received her with red-rimmed eyes and a trembling manner. "He was no angel, Miss Marple," she admitted, dabbing her face with a handkerchief. "But he was my boy. He didn't deserve that." Her words trailed off, heavy with grief. But when Miss Marple gently inquired about Harold's movements in the days before his death, Mrs. Pritchard grew guarded. "He was restless," she said at last. "Spoke of leaving Marleycombe, of opportunities elsewhere. But he wouldn't say where or why." There was something else in her face, a flicker of fear quickly suppressed. Miss Marple noted it but did not press. The farmer's shadow. Later, over tea at the Weatherbys, Miss Marple heard more of Harold's quarrel with Godfrey Blake, the farmer. It seemed Harold had accused Blake of stealing livestock in the night, moving them to another man's field and selling them on. "That boy was far too sharp for his own good," said Mr. Weatherby gravely. "If he made an enemy of Blake, well, Blake isn't the sort to forgive." Miss Marple sipped her tea, considering. Men did not often kill over a sheep or two, but they might if exposure threatened to ruin their livelihood. The girl from Rosehill. The matter of the girl grew clearer when Miss Marple spoke quietly with young Margaret Chandler. "Clara Jennings," Margaret said in a low voice, glancing around to be sure they were alone. "That's her name. Harold was seen with her more than once. People said they were courting, but I don't think it was as simple as that." Miss Marple raised her brows. "How so, my dear?" Margaret hesitated, then whispered, "Because Clara is already engaged. To a man in Rosehill with a temper." A curious alteration. That evening, Miss Marple visited the vicarage, where the vestry papers were being sorted after the break-in. She asked, quite innocently, if she might look at the damaged christening record once more. The vicar obliged, handing her the page with a sigh. "There's nothing in it, Miss Marple. Only some clumsy old ink." But Miss Marple studied the smudged name again and felt a quiet certainty stir. Someone had altered the record, and the alteration had to do with Harold Pritchard's parentage. When she returned to her room, Miss Marple sat with her knitting in her lap, though she did not knit a stitch. It was beginning to form, a pattern of motives layered one upon another. Money, pride, reputation, and the threat of old secrets dragged into the light. "Human weakness," she murmured softly. "It is always the same. And when one weakness touches another, well, murder is never so far away as people like to think." Outside, the night was still, but in her mind, the faint whistle seemed to play again, warning her that the past was not done with Marleycombe. Chapter 8. Testing Alibis. Marleycombe's lanes hummed with tension. The arrest of Peter Chandler had not settled the matter. Rather, it seemed to stir unease, like mud at the bottom of a pond. Every villager looked a little sharper at their neighbor, a little quicker to lower their voice. Miss Marple, outwardly serene, had set herself to the quiet business of listening. She did not interrogate people. That was Inspector Graves' way. Hers was gentler, a question asked at the right moment, a silence left just long enough for someone to fill, a needle slipped into the wool of conversation that caught a stray thread of truth. The farmer's alibi. Miss Marple encountered Godfrey Blake near his fields, barking orders at a hired boy. "You'll have heard, ma'am," he said brusquely. "The inspector's got the right man. Foolish business, but best behind us." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied mildly. "You must have been relieved yourself after those dreadful rumors." Blake's jaw tightened. "Rumors. Idle women's talk. I was home with my wife that night, and she'll swear to it." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Wives are often loyal, Mr. Blake, even when loyalty is inconvenient." The farmer flushed a dark red, muttered something about interfering old women, and stalked away. Miss Marple thought to herself that a too quick temper often signaled a guilty conscience, though not always for murder. The vicar's wife's slip. Later that day, she took tea with Mrs. Calthorpe, who, though anxious, was pleased to chatter. "It was dreadful, the vestry broken into like that," Mrs. Calthorpe said, stirring her cup with unnecessary vigor. But I told the inspector I saw nothing unusual. Miss Marple tilted her head. Nothing, my dear. And yet I thought you once mentioned seeing Harold leave the vestry at dusk. Mrs. Calthorpe colored. Oh, well, yes, but that was weeks ago. Quite different. Of course, Miss Marple murmured. And you did not mention it to the inspector? Well, Mrs. Calthorpe faltered. I didn't want to cause trouble. Miss Marple smiled kindly, but she thought, and trouble is often caused by what people do not say, rather than what they do. The doctor's unease. That evening, Miss Marple called at the Chandler house. Dr. Chandler himself received her, his manner brisk, though his eyes were shadowed from lack of sleep. My son is innocent, Miss Marple, he said without waiting for her to speak. Whatever else they say, I'll not believe Peter capable of such violence. Quite so, Miss Marple said softly. And yet, Harold Pritchard seemed to hear things he ought not. I believe he once overheard something at your surgery. The doctor's hand twitched against the arm of his chair. Nonsense. Village gossip. Nothing of importance. Miss Marple lowered her eyes to her knitting. Of course, of course. Only one wonders why a boy would speak of leaving Marleycombe in such haste, as though he feared something here might catch up with him. For a moment, silence hung between them. Then the doctor rose abruptly, declaring he had patients to see, and left her alone with her tea. Miss Marple sipped it calmly. She had no need of a confession. She had learned enough simply by watching the color drain from his face. By nightfall, Marleycombe's secrets seemed to rustle louder than the wind in the hedgerows. Alibis were spoken too quickly, excuses made too neatly. Miss Marple folded away her knitting and thought, one cannot hurry these things. The truth will show itself in time, if one is patient and watchful. The whistle, faint but insistent, echoed in her memory. Chapter 9. The darker clue. The days grew shorter, and with each dusk, Marleycombe seemed to grow more uneasy. Children were called in early, doors were bolted before supper, and lamps glowed in windows like wary eyes against the night. Yet for all the inspector's bluster, the whisper on every tongue was the same. The killer still walked among them. Miss Marple, for her part, found unease often loosened tongues. Fear made people careless. And careless words were often the most revealing. A shattered lantern. On Wednesday morning, old Mr. Holloway, the sexton, came into the post office pale and shaken. He had found something near the far corner of the graveyard wall. A lantern smashed, its glass scattered across the frost-hardened grass. Not mine, he insisted, setting the pieces on the counter for all to see. And no villager would leave a good lantern to break like that. Miss Marple, who happened to be present, leaned close. The handle was bent as though wrenched in haste, and faint soot stains lingered on the brass. A lantern, she thought, dropped in panic, or in pursuit. A conversation overheard. That afternoon, while shopping for wool, Miss Marple found herself in earshot of two young women gossiping at the draper's. Mark my words, one said. Clara Jennings was seen in Marleycombe last week. She came to meet Harold, though her fiancé would kill her if he knew. Kill her or him? The other giggled nervously. The remark lingered in Miss Marple's mind. A jealous fiancé was dangerous enough, but a woman crossing village lines in secrecy could stir more than one man's temper. A visit to the farm. Later, Miss Marple passed near Godfrey Blake's farm and noted something odd. A length of rope, newly cut, lay discarded by the hedge. Nearby, a patch of earth showed signs of trampling, as though a struggle had taken place. Blake himself emerged from the barn, his face flushed. Looking for trouble, Miss Marple? He growled. Not at all, Mr. Blake, she replied sweetly. I was merely admiring how very sturdy your fences are. His eyes narrowed. Best keep your nose out of farm business. But Miss Marple had seen enough. Rope could bind, drag, or silence. And in a village murder, no discarded object was too small to matter. The music of memory. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting forgotten in her lap. She hummed quietly, searching her memory for the tune of the whistle. Not a hymn, not a nursery rhyme. No, it was something else. Half-remembered, faintly foreign, like a marching song once heard from passing soldiers. And then it struck her. Not a song, but a signal. A whistle meant to summon or warn. If Harold had been lured to the graveyard, it might not have been by words at all, but by that eerie, familiar sound. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with sudden clarity. The whistle was no ghostly omen. It was the hand of a very real murderer, clever enough to cloak violence in superstition. The village still whispered of phantoms. But Miss Marple knew better. Human wickedness was quite sufficient to account for the shadows in Marleycombe, and she would find the one who whistled in the graveyard. Chapter 10. A net of suspicions. The murder of Harold Price no longer felt like a singular tragedy but a spreading rot in the heart of Marleycombe. Each day seemed to draw forth fresh whispers, new theories, and the kind of wary glances that turned neighbors into possible enemies. The inspector's confidence. Inspector Graves stood in the snug of the Green Man, pint in hand, declaring to all within earshot that he would have the culprit before week's end. His words, though meant to reassure, only stirred more fear. "He's certain it was young Colin Hart," muttered Mrs. Peabody, the grocer's wife. "Said the boy had debts from his betting and was seen loitering by the graveyard." "Colin," gasped another. "He's barely 20. Too timid for murder." Miss Marple, sitting quietly near the fire, let the gossip swirl around her like autumn leaves. Too timid, perhaps, but desperation had driven many a mild young man to desperate deeds. A visit from Clara. That same afternoon, Miss Marple received a knock on her cottage door. It was Clara Jennings, cheeks flushed with cold and eyes bright with nervous energy. "I've been told you, well, you sometimes see things others miss," Clara began, twisting her gloves in her hands. Miss Marple offered her a seat and tea, letting the silence draw Clara's story out. "I was supposed to meet Harold," she confessed, voice low. "Not at the graveyard, but at the edge of the meadow. He never came. And now everyone says I lured him to his death." Her words tumbled forth, a secret courtship, a quarrel, a final attempt at reconciliation. Clara swore she never set foot in the graveyard that night. Miss Marple believed she spoke the truth, yet truth did not absolve her from peril. For secrets, once exposed, often bred enemies of their own. A glimpse at the vicarage. That evening, Miss Marple strolled past St. Mildred's. Through the vicarage window, she glimpsed Reverend Whitcomb bent over his desk. A map of the graveyard lay spread before him, marked with curious notations. Why should the vicar concern himself with such diagrams? And why now, after all these years, should he study the ground so intently? The thought lodged itself firmly in Miss Marple's mind. The vicar had been curiously absent from conversations about the murder, always retreating behind solemn platitudes. A man of God, yes, but no man was immune from the darker impulses of pride, envy, or fear. The gossip of children. At dusk, Miss Marple overheard two boys whispering by the gate. "They say the whistling comes when the church bell strikes 12, one said. "Not always," the other replied. "Sometimes it's earlier. My brother says he saw Mr. Blake near the graveyard when it sounded last." Children, Miss Marple knew, often revealed truths unwittingly. The timing of the whistle mattered greatly. For if it could sound at different hours, then it was not tied to phantoms at all, but to the movements of a flesh-and-blood man. The quiet resolve. That night, Miss Marple sat by her hearth, the village map open on her lap. Pins marked where lanterns had been found, where quarrels had been overheard, where shadows had lingered too long. She was not yet certain who the killer was, but she was growing certain of something else. The murderer had made a mistake. A small one, perhaps invisible to others, but plain as day to one who had spent her life watching human folly repeat itself in endless variations. Miss Marple smiled faintly, almost sadly. Soon, the truth would begin to unravel. Chapter 11. The Wrong Man. The people of Marleycombe awoke on Thursday morning to the sound of boots on cobblestones and the rattle of a constable's bicycle bell. Word spread faster than the frost that laced the hedgerows. An arrest had been made. The constable's news. By noon, half the village had gathered near the post office to confirm the tale. Constable Briggs, puffed up with self-importance, announced, "They've taken Colin Hart into custody. Inspector Graves says he'll not wriggle free this time." A lantern found near the graveyard. with Colin's fingerprints clear as day. The crowd buzzed with disbelief. Colin, awkward, shy, known more for his fumbling with sheepdogs than any temper, hardly fit the villagers' idea of a murderer. Yet some nodded grimly. "Debts," muttered Mr. Turner the butcher. And wasn't he seen near the graveyard that night? Fear made easy work of doubt. Colin's mother, Miss Marple, moved by a sense of pity, visited Mrs. Hart that afternoon. The woman sat rigid at her kitchen table, hands clasped tightly as though in prayer. "My Colin would never," she said, eyes glistening. "He may be foolish with cards, but he couldn't harm a soul. And Harold was his friend." Miss Marple listened, nodding gently. Grief and loyalty often blinded mothers, but there was a ring of sincerity in Mrs. Hart's plea. She spoke not with desperate denial, but with quiet certainty. The inspector's case. Later, in the snug of the Green Man, Inspector Graves outlined his triumph to an audience eager for answers. Lantern fragments matched the make young Colin bought from the ironmonger. His debts gave him motive. And he admitted, mind you, that he'd arranged to meet Harold that very night. Clear as daylight. The villagers murmured, half relieved, half unsure. Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively in the corner, sipped her tea. She noted the inspector's pride more keenly than his evidence. Too neat, too swift. The pieces fitted because someone had arranged them so. A quiet observation. That evening, as dusk bled into night, Miss Marple walked past the churchyard. The frost crunched beneath her feet, the air sharp with cold. Near the wall where the lantern had been found, she paused. She bent slowly, examining the ground. The soil bore the faint print of a boot, larger than Colin's slight foot could have made. And nearby, half hidden beneath a tuft of grass, lay a button, tarnished brass, the kind worn on an older man's coat. She held it in her palm, her eyes narrowing. Someone had planted the lantern. Someone with more cunning than Colin Hart ever possessed. Whispers of dissent. By the time Miss Marple returned home, dissent was already creeping through the village. "Too quick," whispered Mrs. Peabody. "Too easy," added the vicar's housekeeper. Suspicion had not vanished. It had only shifted. And in the shifting shadows of Marleycombe, Miss Marple sensed the true murderer smiling in secret. But not for long. Chapter 12. A sinister warning. Marleycombe was not a village used to drama, and so the arrest of Colin Hart had left its inhabitants both uneasy and oddly restless. The common talk was that it must be over now, and yet the lamps still burned longer at night, and doors were locked earlier than before. People said they believed Inspector Graves, but their hearts whispered otherwise. It was into this atmosphere of brittle calm that a new disturbance fell, one that proved the murderer was far from finished. The threatening note. On Friday morning, Mrs. Peabody arrived at the post office trembling, a folded scrap of paper in her hand. It had been slipped under her shop door sometime in the night. In clumsy block letters it read, "Keep quiet or you'll join him." The villagers gathered around as the note was shown, their faces blanching. Who was it meant for? Mrs. Peabody herself, or anyone in Marleycombe who dared speak too freely? Miss Marple, standing at the edge of the crowd, noted two things. The first was the paper itself, coarse, torn from a grocer's ledger. The second was the ink, faintly smudged, as though the writer had a heavy hand and paused often. It was not the work of someone practiced in secrecy, but of someone desperate. Clara in tears. That afternoon, Clara Jennings appeared at Miss Marple's cottage, her eyes red-rimmed. "They say it was meant for me," she sobbed. "Because I told you I was to meet Harold. People are whispering that I've brought this on myself, that Colin's arrest is my fault too." Miss Marple poured her tea and let Clara speak. The poor girl was frightened, not only of gossip but of the shadow that seemed to dog her steps. Did Harold mention anyone threatening him before he died? Miss Marple asked gently. Clara hesitated. Only once. He said someone had been watching him. He thought it was Mr. Blake, but he wouldn't explain why. An uneasy discovery. Later that evening, Miss Marple took her customary walk past the graveyard. The mist lay heavy, muffling sound, and the moon cast a pale silver light on the crooked stones. Near the church door she saw it, a fresh mark, crudely scratched into the wood. It was the shape of a whistle. A childish doodle? Or a deliberate warning? Miss Marple studied it closely. The carving was new, the wood still raw and pale beneath the scratch. And the hand that carved it was not careless but deliberate, pressing deep as though to drive fear into anyone who saw. Gossip at the inn. At the Green Man that night, the mood was dark. First a murder, now threats, muttered Mr. Turner. Mark my words, Colin Hart's not the one, said another. But who else would dare such wickedness? No one noticed Miss Marple quietly observing from the corner. But she noticed plenty. The way Godfrey Blake clenched his jaw whenever Harold's name arose, the way the vicar avoided speaking of the graveyard altogether, the way young Colin's friends spoke with angry loyalty rather than guilt. Someone in that room was not merely afraid. Someone was calculating. A resolution formed. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple placed the brass button beside the threatening note and the sketch she had made of the whistle mark. To the untrained eye, they were scraps. To her, they were pieces of a pattern. The murderer had grown bolder, daring to threaten the village openly. That was dangerous, but also revealing. For boldness often came not from strength, but from the false confidence of a person who believed themselves untouchable. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, eyes thoughtful. The killer was circling closer. And so must she. Chapter 13. The Second Blow. If Inspector Graves thought Colin Hart's arrest had put an end to matters, he was swiftly proved wrong. For in the dead of night, Marleycombe was shaken by a second, even darker event. A scream in the fog. It happened just past midnight. The village lay wrapped in a heavy fog, the kind that swallowed even the sound of one's own footsteps. Yet piercing through the stillness came a scream. High, terrified, cut off too soon. Doors flew open. Lamps flared. And people rushed to their windows only to see nothing but a wall of mist. By dawn, the news was everywhere. Someone had attacked Mr. Holloway, the church sexton, as he crossed the graveyard path. The sexton's tale. Miss Marple, arriving at his cottage, found Mr. Holloway pale and trembling, his head bound with a strip of cloth. I was locking the gate, he whispered hoarsely. I heard it again, the whistle, clear as day. Then something struck me from behind. I fell. If old Barker's dog hadn't started barking, I don't think I'd be here to tell the tale. Miss Marple sat by his chair, listening intently. Did you see who it was? No, he said. Just a shadow, but tall, I think. Taller than young Colin, that's for sure. Her eyes flickered to the cut on his scalp, ragged but shallow. Enough to frighten, perhaps more than to kill. The inspector's dilemma. Inspector Graves, furious and embarrassed, blustered in the square later that morning. Somebody's trying to throw us off the scent. A trick to make us doubt Colin Hart's guilt. Well, I won't be fooled. But the villagers were less certain. If Colin was in custody, how could he have struck Holloway in the graveyard? Fear gave way to anger, and mutters of wrong man rippled through the crowd. Whispers of motive. At the Green Man that evening, theories abounded. It's Blake, I say, growled one man. Didn't Harold once cheat him in a deal? No, the vicar's hiding something. Why else is he always with those graveyard papers? Or Clara, maybe she wanted Harold gone after all. Miss Marple listened, her needles clicking softly. Gossip was a crude tool, but in its roughness it often revealed the grain of truth, the realization. When she returned home, she spread her small collection of clues once more. The button, the threatening note, the whistle carving. Now she added a new detail, the whistle itself. Twice now, the sound had preceded violence. But in both cases, it was not meant to summon but to terrify. Not a signal, she murmured to herself. A performance. Someone in Marleycombe was using the superstition of the graveyard whistle to cloak their crimes. To frighten, to confuse, to mislead. But fear, Miss Marple knew, was a dangerous mask. And masks always slipped in the end. She laid her knitting aside, her face calm, determined. The killer had struck again. Which meant the game was not only continuing, it was accelerating. Chapter 14. Shadows at Midnight. The fog lingered over Marleycombe like a pall, muffling every sound and cloaking every shape. Most villagers now avoided the graveyard altogether, yet Miss Marple chose this very hour to slip quietly from her cottage, shawl wrapped tightly about her shoulders. She had no fondness for danger, but she knew that human beings, when left to their own devices, often revealed far more in the secrecy of night than in the safety of day. A watchful eye. Miss Marple's steps were soft along the lane as she made her way toward the graveyard. She was not alone in her walk, of that she was certain. From the hedgerows came a faint rustle, as though someone moved just out of sight, not following her precisely, but heading in the same direction. She did not turn her head, merely adjusted her pace to be slower, quieter. At the graveyard wall she paused, half hidden by a yew tree. There, through the shifting mist, she saw a figure. Tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the caution of a man who believed himself unseen. Godfrey Blake. The farmhand's secret. Blake carried something in his hand, a lantern, though its light was half-shuttered. He set it down by the church door and bent low, fiddling with a lock. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the glint of metal, a key perhaps, though not one that belonged to him. She waited. After a moment, Blake straightened and looked about, his face hard, set with anger. Then he spat into the grass and strode away toward the fields. When the sound of his boots had faded, Miss Marple crept closer. She examined the church door by the faint glow of her own tiny lamp. Yes, scratches around the keyhole, fresh ones. And in the mud where Blake had stood, a clear boot print. She bent low. The same broad sole she had noticed near the discarded rope at his farm. A startling noise. As she studied the print, a sound broke the silence, the thin, eerie trill of the whistle. It seemed to echo all around, neither near nor far, chilling the marrow. Miss Marple froze. The graveyard lay empty, or appeared to. Yet the sound had come from somewhere close, somewhere human. Then came footsteps, hurrying, but not Blake's heavy stride. Lighter, quicker. A second figure darted between the gravestones, cloaked by fog. She caught only a glimpse, a dark coat, a hand raised to the lips. The Whistler. A calm retreat. Miss Marple did not pursue. At her age, she knew better than to chase shadows. Instead, she slipped back the way she had come, returning to her cottage in thoughtful silence. Two figures, not one. Blake at the church door, and another slipping through the stones. The village had been so certain the whistle was Blake's doing. But what if it was someone else entirely? Someone using his presence, his temper, his secrets, to mask their own? By the time she reached her hearth, Miss Marple had made up her mind. Blake was guilty of something, but perhaps not of Harold's murder. The true killer was craftier, willing to let suspicion fall where it might. And now, she thought with quiet satisfaction, she had seen the mask slip just a little. Chapter 15. The Vicar's Burden. Sunday morning dawned gray and heavy, with clouds pressing low over Marleycombe. The villagers gathered at St. Mildred's, their faces pale in the cold light filtering through stained glass. Attendance was higher than usual, not from piety but from fear. Death in the village had driven people to seek comfort in the familiar rituals of prayer. Miss Marple sat quietly in her pew, her gaze upon Reverend Whitcomb. He delivered the sermon with his usual measured calm, but his hands trembled as he turned the pages of his notes. His voice faltered once, when he spoke of judgment and the wages of sin. A hidden study. After the service, while parishioners clustered in anxious groups outside, Miss Marple lingered. She asked the vicar's housekeeper, Mrs. Gibbons, whether the Reverend might see her for a word about the flower rota. The housekeeper, flustered, ushered her into the vicarage study. The vicar was not there, but his desk was. And on it, the map Miss Marple had glimpsed days before, now spread open with more markings in pencil. She leaned closer. The markings were not random. They noted burial plots, some recent, some decades old. Several were connected with faint lines, almost like a puzzle half-finished. Before she could examine further, the door opened. Reverend Whitcomb entered, his face paling when he saw her. A quiet confrontation. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, his tone forced into politeness. "Looking for me?" "Yes, Reverend," she replied calmly. I was admiring your diligence. You seem to study the graveyard with great care." His eyes flicked to the map. "Purely parish records," he said too quickly. Well, you know how easily such things get muddled over the years." Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "Of course. Though one wonders why such records need to be updated in the dead of night." For a moment his mask slipped and she saw the strain beneath, the weariness of a man hiding something. A confession of sorts. Finally Whitcomb sighed, sinking into his chair. "Very well. I cannot speak openly. But know this. Harold Price had begun asking questions. He was prying into things best left buried. And if he died in that graveyard, it was no accident he was led there." "Then you know who killed him?" Miss Marple asked softly. "No," his voice cracked. "But I know why. There are secrets in Marleycombe, Miss Marple. Old sins. If they come to light, they will destroy more than one family." His eyes pleaded with her, though whether for protection or absolution she could not tell. The whisper returns. That evening, as Miss Marple walked home, the whistle sounded again. This time it was clearer, stronger, rising like a challenge in the cold night air. Villagers shuttered their windows, dogs barked, and the whole of Marleycombe seemed to shrink into silence. But Miss Marple stood still, listening, her face set. The whistle was no ghost. It was a hand guiding events, pressing fear into the heart of the village. And now, she thought, she had a new question. What secret lay buried in the vicar's records? One worth killing for? Chapter 16. The Unearthed Secret. Monday morning dawned raw and bleak. A hard frost silvered the hedgerows, and smoke from cottage chimneys rose straight into the still air. Marleycombe seemed hushed, subdued, as though the entire village held its breath. The hush broke when the sexton, Mr. Holloway, came hammering on doors in the high street. By mid-morning, half the village had gathered at the churchyard, where a discovery had been made, one that chilled them more deeply than the frost ever could. The disturbed grave. Near the oldest section of the yard, where crooked stones leaned like tired sentinels, a grave had been tampered with. The earth was freshly turned uneven, as though dug in haste and clumsily filled in again. Mr. Holloway's voice shook as he pointed. "I didn't do this. Someone was here in the night." Inspector Graves stood scowling at the mound, boots planted firmly in the frost. "Grave robbery, is it? Villagers gone mad with superstition." Or, he lowered his voice, "Someone trying to hide something." Miss Marple, standing a little apart, gazed thoughtfully at the disturbed soil. The stone bore a name almost forgotten. Thomas Jennings, 1878 to 1923. Jennings. Clara's family. The whisper of bones. When the grave was opened under official order, the villagers crowded close, morbid curiosity warring with fear. Inside lay bones, yes, but not just the long-rested remains of Thomas Jennings. Among them was something newer. A small tin box, rusted at the edges but not yet eaten through. Inspector Graves lifted it gingerly, wiped the dirt, and pried it open. Inside were papers, brittle, yellowed, and covered in faded ink. The writing was difficult to decipher, but one phrase caught even the inspector's eye. Debt unpaid. Blake Farm witness silenced. The villagers gasped. All eyes turned toward Godfrey Blake, whose face went a dangerous shade of red. Blake's fury. "You've no right to dig up old slanders." Blake roared, stepping forward. "Those papers mean nothing, lies, all of it." But his outburst did him no favors. Murmurs spread quickly. Debt, witness silenced. Could Harold have found out? Miss Marple's eyes rested on Blake, calm and measuring. His anger was real enough, but was it anger of a guilty man, or one whose old family shame had just been dragged into the light? Clara's distress. Clara Jennings fainted outright when she learned the grave was her grandfather's. When revived, she wept bitterly. "My family had nothing to do with this," she cried. "Grandfather died of fever. I never knew of debts or quarrels. Please, please believe me." Miss Marple laid a hand gently on her arm. "My dear, the sins of one generation are not the sins of another. But I fear Harold stumbled across this very matter, and someone feared what else he might uncover." A growing certainty. That night, Miss Marple sat by her fire, the tin box on her lap. The papers spoke of money borrowed, of a quarrel, of a man silenced. Too vague to convict, yet too precise to dismiss. And one phrase leapt out. Whistle in the dark. Not superstition, not fancy. A signal, a code, tied to debts and violence long buried. She folded the papers carefully. Marleycombe was beginning to show its true face. A place where the past, thought safely hidden, was clawing its way to the surface. And the murderer, Miss Marple thought grimly, was someone desperate to keep it buried forever. Chapter 17. The Second Blow. The discovery in the graveyard had set Marleycombe alight with gossip. For 2 days, the high street had buzzed with whispers. Debts, silenced witnesses, family shame. Mrs. Price at the post office confided to anyone who'd listen that murder always follows old money trouble, while Mr. Larkin at the grocer declared he'd never trusted the Blakes, not for 50 years. Miss Marple, quietly sipping tea by the fire at the vicarage, knew gossip was rarely accurate, but it was often revealing in its own way. Still, she had an uneasy sense that matters were not yet finished. The vicarage alarm. Her unease proved correct. On Wednesday evening, just as dusk wrapped the village in blue-gray shadow, a commotion broke out at the vicarage gate. The maid, Ellen, burst into the drawing-room where Miss Marple was reading. "Ma'am, the inspector. He says there's been another." Miss Marple rose at once, shawl in hand. The barn by the river. The scene lay at the old Blake farm, now half abandoned save for a few outbuildings. In one of the barns, a lantern cast a sickly glow on straw and timber beams. And there, slumped against the wall, was Godfrey Blake. Alive, but barely. Blood seeped from a wound at the back of his head. His breathing rattled, shallow and unsteady. Inspector Graves barked orders, sending men running for the doctor. His face was thunder. Someone meant to finish him. If Ellen hadn't raised the alarm, we'd be looking at another corpse. Miss Marple knelt beside the stricken man. She touched the damp straw, noted the scuff of boots, the angle of the blow. Not a robbery. Not random. Someone had come here with purpose. A warning, not a murder. When the doctor arrived and Blake was carried to the inn to recover, Graves turned to Miss Marple. "This ties it up neat, doesn't it? Blake killed Harold to keep the past hidden. Now someone else, perhaps a family enemy, has struck back." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "No, Inspector. This was not a murder attempt. Look at the wound. Painful, yes, but delivered at an angle unlikely to kill. And the lantern left burning? That was no accident. This was a warning, not a murder." "A warning," Graves repeated, incredulous. Miss Marple's eyes moved to the darkened fields beyond the barn. "Yes. Someone wishes Mr. Blake to stay silent, even now. He knows something he has not yet spoken, and that knowledge makes him dangerous." Whispers in the night. Later, back at the vicarage, Miss Marple lay awake, listening to the creak of the old house. The phrase returned to her, echoing from the papers found in Jennings's grave. Whistle in the dark. She pictured the barn, the scuffed boots, the lantern left as if to guide the eye. Someone had staged this carefully with just enough violence to terrify, but not to kill. The past was reaching out again, not finished with Marleycombe. And Miss Marple knew, before long, the killer's hand would grow bolder. Chapter 18. A Conversation in Confidence. By Thursday morning, Godfrey Blake had been moved to the inn spare room. The doctor insisted on rest, but Miss Marple was granted a quiet audience. She arrived, shawl drawn tightly against the lingering frost, and found Blake sitting upright in bed, pale but alert, with a bandage around his head carefully adjusted. Blake's uneasy admission. "You wanted to see me, Miss Marple?" Blake asked, his voice wary. "Yes, Mr. Blake. I think we need to speak quietly," she said, settling in a chair by the fire. He shifted nervously, eyes flicking toward the closed door. "I've told the inspector everything I know." Miss Marple nodded. "Perhaps. But there are matters the inspector may not perceive. Matters of subtlety of human nature." Blake exhaled heavily. "I don't know what more you expect. Yes, I argued with Harold. Yes, he discovered something about the old debts, the tin in my grandfather's vault. But I never intended. I never harmed him. Miss Marple's eyes were sharp. I do not doubt that, Mr. Blake. But there are others who might have wished to silence him, and they were clever enough to use your quarrel as cover. Unspoken threats. Blake's hand trembled slightly as he took a cup of tea. Who, then? Who would benefit from Harold's silence? That is what we must discover, Miss Marple said softly. And you, Mr. Blake, must remain very calm and watchful. The true killer is bold, but not infallible. Fear sometimes makes them careless. Blake nodded slowly, understanding dawning. The whistle, he said after a pause. I've heard it too. At the graveyard, the barn. I thought it was someone playing tricks on me. I did not realize. You realize now, Miss Marple said, that it is the murderer's signature. They strike and vanish like a ghost, but all ghosts leave traces. A plan formed. As the conversation drew to a close, Miss Marple's mind worked quietly, assembling fragments. The tin box in the grave, the whistle, the threatening note, the barn attack. She began to see a pattern emerging, one that connected past secrets to present danger. Rest now, Mr. Blake, she said as she rose. Keep your eyes and ears open, but say nothing. We may need you to play a careful part in what is to come. Blake's eyes widened. Part? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Patience. Sometimes, the wisest way to catch a cunning hand is to let it move of its own accord. The whisper returns. Later that night, as Marleycombe settled under frost and fog, Miss Marple sat at her window, listening. Once again, faintly, the whistle rose, this time closer, almost daring. It was a challenge, a signal, a promise of further mischief. But Miss Marple, calm and composed, whispered to herself, I am ready. The hand that plays with fear will soon show its true face. The game had reached its penultimate stage. Chapter 19. The trap is set. Marleycombe was wrapped in mist again, that peculiar silence that made each step sound loud enough to echo. The village was tense, nerves frayed after the recent attacks and threats. But Miss Marple, serene as ever, moved quietly through her cottage, preparing for what she had long suspected, the killer's next move. Planning the observation. Miss Marple knew the whistle would sound again. It had become the murderer's signature, a tool to frighten, confuse, and manipulate the villagers. She also knew the killer craved recognition, a sense of control. Her plan was simple yet delicate. Remain hidden near the church and the graveyard, observe without being seen, and allow the killer to reveal himself through action rather than words. She wrote a note for Inspector Graves, carefully phrased to suggest she had a new lead but without revealing her exact plan. Then she prepared herself for the cold, the fog, and the night. Lurking in the shadows. By midnight, Miss Marple was seated in the yew tree at the edge of the graveyard. The mist swirled around her, dampening sound and softening shapes into shadowy silhouettes. She watched the church door, the lane, and the barn beyond. Hours passed slowly. The village slept. And then, a faint, high-pitched whistle floated through the fog. Miss Marple's heart beat calmly. The whistle was close, precise. Someone was moving carefully among the graves, just as she had predicted. The culprit revealed. Through the veil of mist, she glimpsed a figure emerge from the shadows. It was tall, deliberate, carrying a lantern. The hand was gloved, but she recognized the posture, the careful steps, the familiarity with the graveyard paths. Her mind confirmed what her eyes already told her. The murderer was using the whistle to mask movements, to frighten the village, and to strike when attention was elsewhere. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice barely audible. Now we see who walks in darkness. The figure froze, head turning slowly, as if sensing a presence. And then, in the dim lantern light, she recognized the face. Someone she had observed for weeks, someone whose cleverness had hidden greed, fear, and malice behind quiet civility. It was Reverend Whitcomb. The confrontation. The vicar's eyes widened in shock. Miss Marple? How? Not how, Reverend, she said calmly. Why? Why frighten, why threaten, why strike? Harold Price discovered something you wanted buried. And you believed no one would see your hand if you cloaked it in superstition. Whitcomb's composure cracked. I only wanted to protect the village. And my family. Protection is not murder, Reverend, she replied softly, stepping closer. You intended to frighten, but the fear became violence. 2 attacks, a manipulated arrest, threats. All avoidable if honesty had guided you. He slumped, realizing the game was over. The whistle in the dark, the threats, the manipulation. Miss Marple had seen through it all. The arrest. By the time Inspector Graves arrived, guided by Miss Marple's note and subtle signals, Whitcomb was seated quietly beneath the yew tree, head bowed, the lantern extinguished. It's over, she said simply. The truth was in the shadow you left behind. Fear may fool many, but not those who watch with patience. Graves shook his head in awe and irritation. I should have seen it. Miss Marple only smiled faintly, thinking of all the small observations that had revealed the larger pattern. The whistle, the graveyard marks, the discarded notes, and the careful misdirection. Chapter 20. The Confession. The dawn was pale and brittle over Marleycombe. Frost lingered in the corners of the village, and the air carried a sharp, clean scent that hinted at winter's approach. Word spread quickly. Reverend Whitcomb had been caught. The village waited with bated breath, eager and fearful to hear the truth. Miss Marple arrived at the vicarage shortly after the inspector, seeking to understand the full measure of what had driven a man of God to terrorize the village. The vicar speaks. Whitcomb sat in the study, hands folded, eyes weary but clear. When Miss Marple entered, he lifted his gaze with a resigned sigh. You were right, Miss Marple, he began. Harold Price discovered old matters, debts, threats, and a tin of documents my grandfather hid long ago. He questioned too deeply, pressed too far. I panicked. I thought if I could frighten him, perhaps even use his death to seem accidental, I could protect the village and my family from scandal. Miss Marple listened without interruption. Her calm, measured presence seemed to ease him into the confession he had kept buried too long. I used the whistle, he admitted, voice low, to mask movement, to confuse the villagers, to make them think the village was haunted. I never intended him to die. I only meant to frighten, to prevent him from exposing everything. The full picture. Miss Marple laid out the events for him, quietly, carefully. The tin box buried with Thomas Jennings, full of old debts and threats, discovered by Harold. The staged quarrel between Harold and Blake, used to misdirect suspicion. The broken lantern and the whispers in the graveyard, planted as diversions. The threats sent to villagers, each designed to spread fear and confusion. The attacks on Blake and Holloway, carefully calculated to frighten without killing. Each piece fit into the larger puzzle. The vicar had intended to manipulate fear, not commit murder, but in doing so had pushed events to the edge of tragedy. Understanding motive. Miss Marple leaned forward. You feared exposure. You feared shame and scandal. But the methods you chose, intimidation, disguise, diversion, led others to suffer and nearly caused more deaths. One cannot protect by terror. Whitcomb's head fell into his hands. I see that now. I only wanted to preserve what was left of the village's peace. I never wished to harm, though I see how harm followed. Miss Marple's expression softened. Human nature, Reverend, is rarely neat. You acted from fear and pride, but the truth always surfaces. It is better to face it than to manipulate shadows. News reaches the village. By noon, the villagers had been informed. Reactions were a mixture of relief, shock, and disbelief. Godfrey Blake and Clara Jennings were cleared of any wrongdoing, and Colin Hart's name was finally restored. Gossip shifted quickly, from blame to astonishment at the vicar's fallibility. Fear that had gripped the village loosened its hold. Yet beneath the gossip, Miss Marple knew some lessons would linger. The dangerous power of secrets, the quiet ripples of old wrongs, and the need for careful observation of human nature.